and I share the slides now, so you should be able to see it. I'm not able to see your faces anymore, so while I give the presentation, you have to stop me if you have a question during the talk, because somehow once I'm in this slide sharing mode, I somehow do not see anything else from the Zoom, neither the chat anymore, but I think it will be fine. So I would like to present some joint work here. That is work together with Olivier Jacques from University of Montreal and Tim Blandas from Oxford University, the Department for Social Policy and Intervention. And we've been working on this paper for quite a bit of time already. And we still are trying to also add some kind of formal model to this paper. And here in particular, we would really value your inputs and your feedback on the kind of theoretical intuition of our paper. So if you have any ideas of perhaps literature to add towards our theoretical argument, that would be highly appreciated. But also we would like to hear a bit of your thoughts about the idea of this research in general and about the empirical analysis. So this paper is titled Income Decline and the Political Backlash Against Advanced Welfare States. And what we kind of want to pick on is about the phenomenon that there is a lot of debate about the income stagnation that has seemingly affected many advanced democracies in the last decades. So we know in the UK, for example, that since the financial crisis of 2008, 2009, the UK has seen quite a severe case of income stagnation, where most people's real incomes have barely grown for the last 15 years. And so together with the rise in inflation, this has really left many families struggling with the so-called cost of living crisis in the last few years. Similarly, we have in the United States also seen relatively low rates of income growth or wage growth over the past 3 to 4 decades. So when you look at this chart here, the wages for people in the middle of the distribution or those at the bottom of the distribution have barely grown over this long period of 35 years. While those at the top of the wage distribution, they have seen a stronger increase. But even for them, wage growth has been relatively modest. This situation has also changed quite rapidly in the last few years. So in the last 5 to 10 years in the United States, wage growth has picked up significantly, especially for people at the bottom of the income distribution. So we can also see that this situation of income stagnation and income declines for prolonged periods of time, that it can also change relatively quickly and growth can pick up again. And this variation in income growth is also seen when we kind of expand our focus to a larger set of countries and high income countries and democracies across the world. So looking at these 21 countries, which are going to be the focus of our study, here you see the changes in real median income. So these are median disposable household income and how they have grown over time since 1980. It's based on data from the Luxembourg Income Study. And what you see here basically is a picture with substantial variation. You can look at Ireland, for example, which has seen 2 decades or 3 decades up to the financial crisis with a spectacular income growth for median households. Similarly, Spain, Sweden, Norway were examples of very high rates of income growth, the United Kingdom as well. But you also see in this chart several countries facing prolonged or specific instances where incomes have barely grown at all or even declined over time. So look at Germany, for example, which has basically seen very little income growth since the 1980s. Look at Italy, which has seen, especially in the past 15 years, declining rates of median income levels. Switzerland is another example. And then you have countries like Ireland, Spain, or also the UK, which have seen dips in income levels, median income levels, after the financial crisis of 2008, 2009. So overall, this is a picture of a large variation, both cross-nationally, but also over time. And of course, this is not a new finding. It has been documented by Brian, who is here, and many of his colleagues, researchers in income inequality, which have already highlighted that this is in fact a highly variable picture, that neither the observation that there is a uniform trend of income stagnation is true, but also that we do see a certain extent to which median incomes have in fact indeed stagnated for certain periods in the last few decades. And so what Tim, Olivier, and what we are interested in this research is basically in exploring the political consequences of this income stagnation. And specifically, we want to look at what it means for the political support for the welfare state. And we think this is an interesting question because we think that the literature does not put, in fact, a lot of attention on the development of these incomes. So on whether a country is experiencing a lot of income growth or stagnation. It does not put a lot of attention on that, even though the literature puts central attention to the role of income, but in a different way. So what the existing literature on the political support for the welfare state, what it actually looks at is at the effect of income position. So this is the key difference. The literature is not looking at the rate of income growth or income stagnation, but in fact, it's looking at differences between rich or poor households, between those with a high income position and a low income position or a middle income position. And so the discourse in the literature, when looking at research on support for the welfare state, the discourse is basically about kind of a Robin Hood logic of redistribution. So in a Robin Hood logic, redistribution would be determined by how much there is to gain if income is redistributed from rich to poor households. This is one way how the literature thinks about support for the welfare state. And a closely related way in the literature is that the literature looks at large income shocks, specifically the case of unemployment. So what happens when people lose all of their income from one day to the other, when they become unemployed, for example? This is, of course, a nice identification strategy, so it's easy also to look at the effects of such large income shocks. But it's a very particular case, because when you lose all of your income by becoming unemployed, it also means that you change your position in the income distribution, and that you probably go from somewhere along the distribution to the bottom because you lose all of your income that you earned in the market. So these are very important ways, I think, to understand welfare state support. But it's analytically something different from these kind of patterns that I showed here. So what happens with these gradual changes in people's incomes over time? So what the literature finds is, in terms of the direction of the effects, it's very clear. It's that the lower your income position is, or if you become unemployed and if you experience a large negative income shock, then almost the whole literature basically finds and argues that this leads to higher support for the welfare state. Yeah, so this is theoretically justified in the logic of individual self-interest. Basically, the poorer you are, the more you have to gain from welfare state policies that redistribute income. So this is very straightforward. But as I said, when we look at the effect not of income position or of large income shocks, but when we look at gradual income changes and we try to hold the income position and the risk of unemployment constant, then the effect that we might observe might actually turn out to go in a different direction. And this is what we explore in this paper. So we basically study the research question about what the consequences of income growth are on the support for welfare state policies. And we look at three specific areas. We look at preferences of individuals towards taxation. We look at preferences towards spending cuts as kind of a similar similar manifestation of welfare state policies. And finally, we also look at the electoral politics. So how people vote towards governments that have actually implemented spending cuts. So these are our three complementary research questions. They are looking at slightly different things also because of the empirical data that is available in order to test these associations. Let me go to explain briefly our theoretical framework for this paper. And as I was mentioning, this is very much work in progress. So we are trying to develop a formal model in order to derive expectations about how income changes should be related to support for taxation and welfare policies. But this is still ongoing work. And so I will here in this presentation just give you the main intuition of our argument. So basically how we try to derive our expectations. So as I was mentioning, the standard argument in the literature focuses on redistributive self-interest, and very straightforwardly it argues that the lower one's income position is, so if you are poor or if you have a high unemployment risk, so if you have a high risk of having zero income at some point in the future, then your support for taxation and welfare state policies will increase. So this has been around for decades in research, starting from Meltzer Richard, which basically justifies which individuals should have an interest in redistribution. Now, what's important here to already highlight a bit is that when we talk about redistribution, we can conceptualize redistribution both in a vertical sense, redistributing incomes from the rich towards the poor, but we can also think of redistribution in a more horizontal sense. And this can involve redistribution of one's own income in the present towards the future. So when you think about pension policies, for example, horizontal redistribution would be a policy that actually redistributes income over the life cycle, so that when you get retired, you will be able to benefit from pension policies in old age. Now, we argue that when we look at income changes, so how high income growth is or whether incomes are declining, that what we want to look at is when income changes, but the distribution of income is not modified. So basically, we are interested in cases where basically everybody in a population is experiencing a certain income growth or a certain extent of income stagnation. And we want to look at what happens in such a situation. Now, our kind of main or our first starting point for our argument is that what is our observation that when your income is falling, so when you experience a decline in your income, that this is connected with a certain pressure on your consumption levels that you have in the moment. So we make the connection that when income changes, this has an implication on people's consumption levels. It doesn't mean that they actually do change their consumption, but when your income gets smaller, there is a certain pressure to reduce your level of current consumption because you cannot necessarily afford the level of consumption in the long term anymore. And our intuition, or the main argument that we want to make with regards to welfare state support, is very simply that in such a situation, when your real incomes are falling and there is pressure on your consumption levels, that reducing taxes is one possibility in order for you to still be able to preserve your disposable income and to maintain current consumption levels. So why do we make this this intuition? And maybe it's also helpful maybe to think about it from the other way around. So in a situation not of falling incomes, but when income is actually increasing, so when there is a lot of income growth, then we would expect that there is an opportunity to consume more. So the pressure on your consumption is lower, yeah, and there is room for consuming more goods. But this also leaves a certain room for also higher taxes, because there could also be with these taxes, they would be useful in order to finance insurance. So because with the taxes towards the welfare state, you're also able to buy goods in terms of social insurance. So you can, for example, buy into pension policies, so insuring yourself against old age risks, for example. And also, such a situation of increasing income would allow you to achieve higher levels of redistribution, which would be nice if you are in the lower parts of the income distribution. But also altruism can also happen in this situation. So you might, even though you might not benefit yourself from redistribution, you might draw some benefits of giving this additional income towards the poor. And so there is some research that shows that there are benefits to altruism in such an instance. Now, of course, this argument that reducing taxes as a reaction to falling incomes, of course, it could help you to maintain your current consumption levels, but of course, it would also come at a cost. So there are clear costs associated with this. So if you would reduce taxes, yeah, if this would be implemented, this would, of course, reduce also your present consumption that you may draw from consuming redistributive benefits. So if you at the moment benefit from existing welfare benefits, then of course a tax reduction would endanger those benefits. And in addition, reducing taxes could also reduce future consumption in case in the future you would lose your income in case of unemployment, for example, or retirement. So a tax reduction would also have implications and the cost of reducing the benefits from welfare state insurance. So we argue that these are the costs that come with a tax reduction, but we argue that in a situation of stagnating or falling incomes, that overall the balance is still positive for both people below the median and people above the median of the income distribution. So we argue that for people below the median, the poor, that they will gain a higher amount from reduced tax costs compared to what they lose in terms of redistributive benefits and in terms of future insurance. And this has to do with the fact that, first of all, the benefit that you gain from reduced taxes is immediate. So there is no uncertainty and there is an immediate benefit. There is no deadweight loss, yeah, because often there is a deadweight loss from taxation because over time the utility or some of the tax value might decrease over time, but you get an immediate gain from a reduced tax cost, and that is what we think makes it attractive for people below the median to demand reduced taxation in terms of income stagnation.
Hello, David. Can you hear me?
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
Hi, nice to see you.
Hi.
Just a clarifying question. When you're talking about taxes, you're talking about income taxes. This is not VAT or things like that.
Yes.
So the instrument would be only saying like changing the marginal rates or the base income which in which you start paying something.
It's the focus on income taxes. Yeah. Indeed.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Great. And the same interest we think applies also for people above the median. So we would also argue that they would also gain from a reduced tax rate, yeah, because they pay a lot of taxes. And we argue that, of course, they would also gain from the lower extent of redistribution that would follow from this. So these are clear immediate gains. For people above the median, they also have some costs. So they lose the benefits from altruism that they may have had before. And they also lose, importantly, some of the ability of future insurance. So these are the costs that they have. But we argue that for both poorer and richer individuals, they have a gain from reducing taxes in a situation of falling incomes. So this may be plausible. So this is our intuition, yeah. And how we try to develop it in our formal model is by using standard modeling assumptions about modeling utility for individuals, depending on whether they are employed or unemployed, and depending on the level of taxation. So these are the main parameters. And then we model how this situation with a certain level of taxation, how it changes when the income of different people in this model changes over time. So one intuition that we then make in the model is that for insurance, yeah, so paying taxes in order for pensions, for example, in order to have social insurance, we argue that this is a luxury good which helps people with higher income more than people with lower income, because people with higher income can actually devote a larger share of their income to this insurance. And so we argue that when income declines, that this also reduces your demand for such insurance. So basically the logic here is that when income falls, that it's less easy to buy insurance for these type of welfare benefits that you will only get in the future. So in a sense, you become more present-oriented when income falls. This is also our second intuition. So in general, we have a discount rate in this model. We assume that people discount their consumption in the future vis-a-vis their present consumption. And so here again, we kind of have the intuition that when income declines, that this reduces the preferred future consumption in retirement. So once again, we think that it's possible when income declines that this present orientation becomes even stronger because you are in a situation of losing income, and it's more important that you can maintain your current consumption levels in the present. And so what happens in terms of future consumption through retirement becomes somewhat less important. The third intuition is, again, a standard feature of many of these models in redistribution research, is that we assume that taxation has a deadweight loss, and that this deadweight loss of taxation becomes more costly as your current income falls. So if your current income falls, you are more hesitant to pay taxes for a policy where some of this amount may actually get lost, yeah, in terms of inefficiencies and so on. So we assume here that people then really are more concerned about this deadweight loss, which can occur with taxation in a situation when incomes stagnate or fall. And the last assumption here is that we look at altruism. So this has been part of some research, yeah, on redistribution preferences. Altruism is something that can be attractive for people with high income. They may gain some maybe immaterial benefit of redistributing incomes towards other groups as well. But we assume that this is much more attractive if people's consumption is very high already, and if they are not really needing, they don't really need additional income for even higher consumption. So in a situation where income falls, we argue that people have somewhat less, it's less attractive for even richer individuals to support altruistic welfare policies. Because again, the intuition is that they really focus more on protecting their current consumption, and they focus more on kind of the present benefits for themselves. They are more self-oriented in a sense. And this is why also this altruism effect also declines when income is falling. So these are the sort of intuitions with which we are playing at the moment in our theoretical model. It's still a bit work in progress, how exactly we want to incorporate them. But if you have any ideas also of literature that kind of goes in support of some of this intuition, I would be very grateful if you would share some of these insights. Now, our argument then, so this argument that reducing taxes is a solution for many individuals to preserve income and maintain their current consumption. So we do see in terms of empirical evidence that this is consistent with observations like, for example, that governments historically were able to increase taxes in times of high economic growth. So when you think about the 1940s, 50s, 60s, and 70s, when economic growth was very high and citizens' real incomes were increasing from year to year, this was a period when governments were able to significantly increase income taxes without actually reducing citizens' consumption levels. So our model, in a sense, gives a micro foundation for this historical observation that if citizens' real income growth allows them to still also increase their consumption levels, then it's also possible for governments to levy higher taxes because citizens would still have higher consumption levels left. So this is a political justification or explanation why taxes could be increased during that historical time period.
David?
Yeah.
Hi, Luis again.
Hey, Luis.
But you also have the opposite effect.
Yeah.
Or you might have. I'm looking at I was curious about the data on government deficits in the. Well, I'm looking at the Eurozone, and essentially you have, like, when it's a financial crisis, you have that the level of debt of deficit increases, and then it starts to go down as the economy recovers. So you can have also an effect when there's a downturn. You have a lowering taxes also without reducing the citizen consumptions if the government steps up the deficits and to perhaps cover some of the, unemployment benefits or something like that. I don't know. So maybe you also have the other effect.
So governments could use counter-cyclical spending, right? Also in economic downturns.
Without,
I think that's true. The question, so in our kind of in our intuition, this is somewhat less attractive because so let me check here. The question is a little bit then, why would rich people in a recession, why would they support counter-cyclical policies? Because they have no benefit from it, right? It's in the end, it's just a huge redistributive cost for them if they would reduce taxes in order to spend more on policies that that come to the benefit of all citizens. So I think the clear
as a top down from the government, like we have to do something for the crisis, and a top down rather than a bottom up approach.
Right. In terms of a top down approach, I think it may certainly be the case. So I think that's definitely possible, right? That there is also this motivation. I think in our paper, what we try to see is indeed more the bottom up approach. So we want to explain politically when are actions by governments kind of politically legitimized, and not just in terms of like immediate crisis. So this may be a little bit the difference, that this counter-cyclical spending is something that is really acute in economic crisis, when governments need to react fast, perhaps, while kind of our argument tries to explain a bit more long-term political support. Do you know what I mean? I think so it should be applicable in both downturns and in economic upturns. I think that's what I would see a little bit as a difference. But I think it could still exist even at the same time, in a certain way. Yeah. Thanks for the point, Luis. Let me just mention some other observation to which our argument also provides some insights. So we also, I think, have a consistent argument with the observation that there are nominal wage rigidities. So that we have this observation that prices and wages are sticky often in economies. And this, we think, is also consistent with our idea that when people's income changes in the short term, that for individuals, it's important that they want to preserve their incomes in order that they can really maintain their current consumption levels. So we think this has some similarities with our argument and is consistent with it as well. And finally, we have a consistency with our argument to the observation that taxes and spending are sometimes found to be a luxury good. So we have quite a lot of empirical research that actually shows that voter sentiment, so kind of the political mood, moves to the left in good economic times, so in times of high economic growth, and that it becomes more conservative, it moves to the right in bad economic times. So this is a consistent empirical finding that we see quite often, but it's not well explained. And in our model, this movement of the kind of the political support to a more conservative stance towards the welfare state in bad economic times, this is exactly what kind of our intuition, that when people experience stagnating incomes, that they prefer reduced tax rates. This is what our model precisely implies. So then from this theory, we derive three concrete hypotheses. So we try to hold income position and unemployment risk constant. And our first hypothesis is that lower income growth reduces support for taxation. Then secondly, and closely related, we expect that lower income growth reduces support for taxation, and that can also happen through higher support for spending cuts. So people prefer spending cuts in order to achieve this lower taxation. That's the second expectation that we have. And thirdly, we look at the electoral effect, and we expect that lower income growth leads to higher support for governments that retrench the welfare state. So we know that retrenching the welfare state, cutting back spending, that this is very unpopular potentially. But we expect that when governments do this in a situation of income stagnation or of declining incomes, that they get punished to a far lesser degree than if they would cut back spending in normal times. So this is our third expectation. Let me jump a bit into the empirical design, so how we test this argument. We have some different types of analysis in this paper. We have three types of analysis. One is a panel data analysis of policy preferences at the micro level. So this is our first analysis, our most, if you want, kind of most close at causal identification, because we have panel data of the same individuals where we observe their perceived income changes as well as policy preferences. Then we have a second analysis, which is also at the micro level, but it's a cross-national analysis of policy preferences. This is much more to increase external validity of our argument. And then third, we have a voting analysis where we look at people's voting behavior in terms of support for the incumbent government. And then we have a fourth analysis, which we only present in the appendix, but I'm happy to talk about it if you want, which is a macro level analysis. And it's basically a test that if our argument would be true, that income stagnation would be associated with lower support for the welfare state, then we should also see higher instances of spending cuts if there is income stagnation. And we do have some analysis that demonstrates this association. Here, because it's a macro analysis, we are very skeptical about causality. So we think that there is a huge risk of endogeneity because both income stagnation and spending cuts tend to occur often simultaneously, for example, during economic downturns. So in this macro level analysis, we don't really have a lot of confidence in terms of causal identification. So that's why we don't present it very centrally in this paper. But the results are consistent for our argument. So the first analysis, this draws on data from the United States. We use the General Social Survey. This is a panel data set between 2006 and 2014, where each individual gets observed up to 3 times. And the GSS also has a non-panel data section, where since 1980, there are every 2 years, there are data available from cross-sections, cross-sectional data sets from individuals in the United States. So this allows a longitudinal analysis, not a panel analysis, but also still a longitudinal analysis of income changes over a long period of time. In the GSS, we have a nice dependent variable that directly asks about people's preferences of the income tax level. If the income tax you have to pay is too high, about right, or too low. And we code people considering the taxes as too low or about right as 1. So they are in support of taxation, and those that say it's too high as 0. And then our main independent variable here is a subjective measure of economic change, which asks that during the last few years, if people's financial situation has been getting better, worse, or stayed the same. And here we do quite some validation analysis with objective income growth data, which has varied quite a lot in the United States, the extent of income growth that people have objectively experienced. And we do find that there is a quite close correspondence between this subjective indicator of economic change and the objective income growth data that we have from Luxembourg income studies. We use fixed effects models for our panel data analysis, and we use for the cross-sectional analysis OLS with year fixed effects. Then we also have some additional surveys from Japan and Canada, which asked basically almost the same variables, and which we replicate in order to see if the US survey is very different from these other contexts. And we find, however, that the results are very similar also in Japan and in Canada. So on the results here for this first important part of our analysis, so the panel data analysis, here we do find support for our hypothesis. So we see that when people perceive their economic situation to decline, that they are less supportive of paying taxes. So they think that taxes are too high in this situation, yeah, if they perceive economic decline. And what it's important is to see that the effect of economic decline is in the opposite direction from having a low income. So you see that the sign for income decile is the same as for perceived economic decline. So it means that if you have a low income decile, it would be a positive effect. And it would mean that people with low income, they are much more supportive for paying taxes. And this is what all the literature says, that people with low income are more willing to pay taxes. They are more in favor of redistribution. So our focus on income changes does not contradict this literature. We still think this is very important, that poor people are more in favor of taxes. But what we do see is that when people's income situation declines, that their tax support also tends to decline. And we replicate this finding for the cross-sectional analysis in the United States, as well as for the surveys from Canada and Japan with basically the same items. Okay, then our second analysis is the cross-national analysis. So here we use ISSP data from 21 countries between 1985 and 2016. So this gives us a nice external validity because we can basically test 21 countries which had widely different experiences in terms of income growth and stagnation across a relatively long period of time. What we don't have in the ISSP, unfortunately, is a good direct measure for taxation preferences. So what we do have instead is a measure for support of welfare state retrenchment. So our main measure is whether people are in favor of cutting government spending. Of course, we assume that if you cut government spending, it also implies that you are willing to also, or that you see a connection also to a lower level of taxation. This is our assumption that if you agree to cuts in government spending, it's because you want to reduce the tax burden for yourself. Yeah. Now, the key independent variable here is objective income growth or income decline, which we estimate from Luxembourg income studies. We look at each decile's income growth of their real disposable household income, and we link these measures for income growth back to the ISSP. And then we estimate multi-level models with country intercepts. Now, the results here are that higher rates of income growth are associated with lower support for spending cuts. So in the other way around, it would mean that income decline is associated with higher support for spending cuts. And again, this is the opposite effect of the income level. Yeah. So again, we find that people with higher income levels, they are more supportive of spending cuts, but it's the opposite effect from income growth or income stagnation. So if people's income stagnate, they become more supportive of spending cuts as well. And it's quite substantial effects that we observe. So if people's incomes, not just if they decline, but also if they stagnate, so if they are seen as in an area of a little bit more than 0 to 1% of income growth each year, we do see that there is quite a large increase in support for spending cuts of the welfare state. So this is just cross-sectional evidence, but it's robust to quite a few modifications, different measurements of income growth, different control variables, fixed effects models, and so on. So it's a cross-sectional finding, but quite a robust finding, which lends external validity, we think, to our argument. And then the final analysis, just briefly, is a voting analysis. So we look at data on how people voted for the party that was in government in the previous election. And the key independent variables here are, again, a measure of income growth from Luxembourg income study. Then we have a measure of retrenchment. So we look at if governments implemented a spending cut in its time in office. And we look at the interaction between income growth and spending cuts. And what we observe first is that if people experience income growth, if they experience a lot of income growth, they reward the incumbent government for this growth. So this is not surprising. If people have been doing well economically, they tend to reward the incumbent government and they tend to re-elect this government. This is not a surprising finding. Also not surprising, we see that if the government has implemented a spending cut during its tenure in office, it has a significantly lower chance of being re-elected by individuals. So spending cuts are unpopular. Again, that's not a new finding. It's not a very surprising finding, but it's something that we also see in our data. But our kind of key focus is on the interaction between spending cuts and income growth. And we do see a significant interaction here. And basically, I would like to show you the conditional effects plot for this interaction so that you can make sense of what it means. And what you see here on the horizontal axis is the amount of income growth that people experienced. And you see that if this is in the right area, so if people experienced a lot of income growth, then spending cuts has the effect of reducing re-election probabilities for governments. So then the coefficient is negative, and that indicates lower support for the incumbent in case of a spending cut. But what's remarkable is that in the left-hand side of this graph, if there is a situation of income stagnation or income decline, that spending cuts don't have this negative effect anymore on re-election probabilities, but to the opposite, they actually increase the likelihood of re-electing the incumbent government. So it means that in a situation of income stagnation, that spending cuts may actually be relatively popular among people experiencing this income stagnation. So in conclusion, what this paper tries to do, we try to provide a sort of a different explanation on how we think about welfare state retrenchment, how we think about support for policies like tax cutbacks or tax reductions and spending cutbacks. And we distinguish ourselves from the conventional thinking in the literature. So when the literature talks about welfare state cutbacks or tax reductions, there tend to be a lot of functionalist arguments. For example, there is one line of argument that looks at international pressures. Like in the financial crisis, this line of argument would be that the Eurozone, in the European Monetary Union, together with the European Central Bank and the IMF, that it sort of pressured domestic governments to implement austerity and to implement spending cutbacks. And while we think that this may have happened in some instances, we also think that it's important to look at a different explanation and to see if there is a domestic rational explanation that has to do with actual political support for such spending cuts. And we do argue that the case of income stagnation shows that there is some political argument there, because income decline and stagnation has happened in many countries to different extents, but it has happened. We would have this argument that this has enabled a political coalition between especially middle and high income groups that were then able to gain political momentum for spending and tax cuts. That's kind of the political implication of our argument. And so our arguments here then contribute to several debates in political science. So about the political consequences of income stagnation, this is something we know very little about so far. It contributes to the debate why governments implement retrenchment, even though this is so risky for them, even though they know this may be unpopular among voters. But as we argue, it's not always unpopular. And why austerity happens, even though there is economic analysis that suggests that austerity is actually inefficient during crisis. So what we discussed, that there is also the option of producing counter-cyclical policies, but still we do observe a lot of pro-cyclical austerity policy, which is simply economically inefficient. But our kind of logic with the political consequences of income stagnation would explain a bit why it could still happen. And thanks a lot for listening to this talk. And now I'm really curious to hear your feedback. And I'll stop sharing, then we can also ask questions here in this format. Yeah. maybe I would like to just open the floor and ask if anybody has a question or some comments.
Hi, David. Can I be first? I don't know.
Yes,
I didn't
please.
raise my hand. Yes. I don't know. Just beginning with the last reflection. Like I think maybe even if it is inefficient in the long term, I don't know if you are Keynesian and believe in the counter-cyclical policies. I agree with your main argument here that at the micro level, people tend to think they may be better off with lower taxes, right? And I also think that there is a more complex thing that may be playing there, that there's always interest from some groups, right, in society to have lower taxes, which is the people who are well off, and the ones that actually bear the burden of taxes, even people who are poor perceive they pay a lot. I mean, you never really take into account that if you lower taxes, there's someone else who's saving much more than you are, and your benefits will be, of course, impacted by this. But that is a very complex thought that it's hard to. But that's why I think you're right in this sense. I missed like going to the paper, right? Like some suggestions or things that I think you could add at the beginning about the intuition. I was wondering whether you could look into the empirical economics literature to support all these intuitions with things done in the lab. I don't know any paper in particular, but I think there is something missing in the paper there. If you're gonna sell it as a model that it's being validated with the survey data, maybe the micro intuitions about behavior should be more supported in a way. And I think they might be already existing in the literature, right? Like when people like lost income, they value the present more.
Yeah.
They are less willing to insure because that is a luxury good. I think that all makes sense and shouldn't be that difficult to find something that in the lab can build up to some of your main intuitions or assumptions, right? So that would be one suggestion, to look into that. Yeah. Second thing that I missed, of course, that is that I think you should be clear that your assumption is a flat rate, right? You're not talking about progressivity at all,
right?
Because
right.
because then I think if the question in the surveys was like, do you think rich people in this time of crisis should pay more now to bear the burden in a greater way than that you are? In that case, people would agree, but that is the. But of course, then when government change taxes, they change for everyone. Even if poor people save £10 and rich people save 10,000, right? But I think it should be made clear that you're talking about an implicit. You said it, right? You said that progressivity is out of the question in this paper, and that you are still aware that people with lower income would support progressivity more than the rest.
Exactly. Yeah.
But maybe to be a little bit more explicit.
Really
And the third thing was about the last model 3. That one, I think it's very ambitious to cross spending cuts and and income growth and support for the government, because the sample was small, right? It was 15 countries. Yeah. Even if I don't know how many waves of elections do you have, but I would think that if you want to focus on the countries that have at the same time spending cut and income growth or income decline, you may end up with very few countries in which very particular things could be going on to extrapolate that there is a regularity in that. If your income is going down, and your government cuts spending, you are more willing to support it. I don't know, that it's that I didn't see that very intuitive, and maybe the analysis with 15 countries could be a little bit like insufficient, but that is just a thought looking at the sample and the complexity of the relation in a way.
Yeah, no, thanks. But these are really helpful comments. Thank you so much for these. And I fully take also the first comment really to justify these assumptions better especially in the economics literature. I think it's something we try to do. We thought it would be super easy to justify all of these intuitions. It turns out that when you're looking for specific justifications, right, that for example, a falling income really makes the value of future insurance less important or something like that, it turns out to be surprisingly difficult sometimes to find evidence for precisely the things that we want to highlight in the model, but it's definitely work that we have to.
I don't know, one tends to think that there's people doing experiments for everything, and maybe it's not the case, but
no, but it's a job we have to do. And then the question about tax progressivity, I think that's definitely important that we do not look at that. I think the results would turn out to be very different, because tax progressivity is all about this redistributive interest. So it will depend even much more strongly on income position. I'm not sure how it would be related precisely to our focus on income growth. So we do not look at it, and and I think we need to be very clear that we are talking about the tax burden for oneself.
No, but I think it is still your paper. It's still very valid in the sense that I don't see a progressivity debate during crisis. It's about general increase or decrease in taxes, which is what you're analyzing. But it's but so in that case, I don't need. But
no,
and then the third and about the third one about the number of countries in the what is your thought about?
I mean, I agree that this is maybe a little bit of a stretch. So it is a low number of countries. We do have a significant time dimension there. So we have data between 96 and 2015. So we have, like, in each of these 15 countries, we have at least 4, 5, 6 elections. So there is something there, but I fully agree with you that it's something to be careful about. I'm optimistic in the sense that the results, the standard errors seem to be relatively small, so it seems to be relatively precise, but I take your point. So it's well taken.
I don't know if you could test taking some of the countries in and out and seeing whether that maybe there is one driving the effect, or even if it still looks significant, and with just to validate and make it more robust.
That's a very good suggestion.
But anyway, thank you.
Thanks.
Great
Thanks,
talk.
Juan.
I really enjoyed. Thanks.
Thanks, Juan. That's really good comments. Yeah. Does anybody else have some questions? I realize we're a little bit over time, but I'm happy to stick around for a bit longer if it's also fine for you, Fiona, or...
Absolutely fine by me. No worries.
Okay.
You keep going.
Great. Thanks so much.
Thanks,
Brian.
Very interesting indeed, and a lot to react to, and a lot that one could focus in on. But in the limited time available, I guess my big picture question was a very simple one, and that is whether it makes sense or is the best approach to combine periods of income stagnation and periods of recession. So that, in the way you set it up, you made the point that there's quite a lot of literature about what happens in a crisis, and that there was very little about what happens in prolonged periods of slow growth.
Mm-hmm.
But I wonder if those realities aren't very different, in fact, and that reactions that you will get both by governments and by electorates in what's generally perceived to be a crisis will simply just be very different to the reaction to, 10 or 15 years of little or no income growth.
Mm-hmm.
So while some of your theoretical intuitions, if you like, sort of look as if they apply, I'm not really sure that they do hold across those two different. When those realities are seen by everybody to be very different, and to require a very different policy reaction. I mean, it's still a bit of a mystery as to why people are so willing to accept austerity in a crisis.
Yeah.
But the fact, you can tell a story about that doesn't really apply in a prolonged period of stagnation. So I wonder if you wouldn't be, at least as a supplementary analysis, if you wouldn't be better off to separate out those two and look at them separately.
Yeah, this is a very, very good comment. And I think it's both kind of for the framing a little bit, something we struggled because we were interested in looking explicitly at those prolonged phases of stagnation, also outside of crisis explicitly. Also because the crises are, I think, in terms of like the overall picture, they're much better understood. There has been much more research on them and really explored the behavior of people during crisis, while in terms of really the effects of stagnation and what it makes to people's policy preferences is so much less explored. So our kind of motivation was to cover these instances of stagnation outside of major downturns more. But in the end, it's very hard for us to separate all the theoretical and empirical parts between those two situations. So indeed, what we could do more is, first of all, to clarify a little bit more under which of the two scenarios our arguments apply. So is it arguments that are based on only on phases of income stagnation but not recessions, or is it arguments that apply also for recessions as well? And empirically, as you say, I think it would be good in terms of a supplementary analysis to restrict our focus a bit more on maybe just the periods of stagnation. Yeah, I think that's a very useful way forward. We do have, I mean, in the paper, so what we do try to model also in our theoretical model is to try to separate out the effect of becoming unemployed. So if people become unemployed, that is an effect that we are not covering or not exploring per se, but we have it in the model so that what we actually pick up as kind of our intuition for income falls is on top of all the effects that happen with increasing unemployment, for example. And empirically, we test for things like becoming unemployed or also at the macro level, we test for GDP growth and the unemployment rate at the macro level. So we try to control for the typical syndromes of recessions. But of course, it's still, the point is still that they may not be the same comparable situations. So I definitely take this point to think further. Yeah, thanks.
I mean, I guess the second, I'll let others know, but I guess the second point is again to just reiterate that in the real world, in reacting to political options, people do very much distinguish between different sorts of tax cuts and different sorts of spending cuts. And you have, even in the UK of late, you've had the interesting one where government that's imposed austerity has done so while at least purporting to protect the NHS. Hasn't done it very well, but that's been the whole claim. And now its big political salvation is to be from cutting national insurance contributions, which are seen to have a very specific appeal as a tax cut for very particular constituencies. So in the real world, as you know much better than I do, it doesn't operate at the level of generality that these survey questions do. And people's reaction is very much about, you can cut other things, but don't cut the NHS, and cutting national insurance is not the same as cutting income tax or whatever.
No, that's very well taken, and it's something we simply cannot go into much further level of granularity, but I think you're completely right that in terms of political effects as well, this is a key instrument that governments also have at their disposal to really refine this much more and align it with the political demands of their potential constituencies. So yeah, it's very well taken. Yeah, thanks. Yeah. Luis, I see you unmute.
Hi, Brian, by the way. How are you doing?
Great to see you.
Good to see you, yes. So one clarifying question. Your data, can you observe each person's income evolution, or you are imputing the decile in which they're in, and then from the LIS, you're imputing their wage growth?
Yeah, we're imputing it. No, we cannot see it directly.
Cannot
we're
observe
imputing it. No.
There's no database that you have both preferences and. I mean, I'm actually looking at the
long-term income.
I'm looking at the Understanding Society, you know, the ACDs. And unfortunately, only in waves 11 and 12, which I don't remember which year they are, they do ask for whether cutting taxes or raising taxes from 0 to 10, and they also have the income, but it's only 2 years. I mean,
exactly, and that is in the UK especially. It's, you know, we have had big developments before the financial crisis. Income growth was extremely high. Afterwards, it was for 15 years declining in real terms for many people, or stable. So there, unfortunately, really there is not many years in which preferences are available, or policy preferences. In many other of the Understanding Society years, there is just like general items, a little bit of whether you're left or right wing, but it's not granular enough. But but we think, I mean, the indirect approach, it's
fine. Sure, it's just would be like amazing if you could be able to observe actual people's income and their preferences. And the second point is, so cutting taxes and increasing taxes is a very broad concept, and for instance, in the UK, what I remember at least is that it's a lot about the NHS, you know, like whether you're cutting taxes, we're reducing the NHS, or you're increasing taxes to fund the NHS, whatever. So that is, I don't know, like if I'm gonna be cutting taxes for, I don't know, like parks or roads, okay, that's one thing. But then cutting taxes for the health system, that's an entirely different beast altogether. So is there a way you can sort of distinguish between what is the generality of the preference the particularity of the preference, or this is just very broad, raise taxes, lower taxes?
Yeah, in the tax analysis from the United States, it's really just this broad level of your own income tax. It's in a sense, this is a quantity that we think, you know, is of interest from the individual, right? It's how high do you perceive your tax burden to be? But indeed, I think if you look at real debates about tax cuts, about the political debates around it, I think then it would be important to discuss the arguments. What do governments argue, why they do it? So we can do a little bit something for the spending cut analysis, right? Because there we don't have just spending cuts in general, but for example, we have cutting back spending on unemployment benefits, for example, right? So this is a typical welfare policy. Of course, it's much more relevant if you are poor and you have a high unemployment risk. But it's a policy that also applies, you know, that can apply to anybody. Anybody can become unemployed. So this is a more specific policy. But yeah, But indeed, we don't have like the precise justification of governments, what they use the tax cuts for.
Yeah, just to finish. So if you look, I'm gonna send you the link. This is for the UK, the Understanding Society. Basically, the question is framed as cutting taxes or raising taxes for health and social services,
Right.
and 80% of people is in the middle or to raise taxes. So because the question is, I don't know, because of the importance of the NHS, whatever, of course, people are going to be much more inclined to say like, no, let's not lower taxes. But of course, that's different if you have, if it's about, I don't know, if the UK you have fuel taxes, but you know, probably lots of people say, yes, let's cut fuel taxes. You know, so then the type of tax. Okay, well, that was my comment.
Thanks. No, that's very good input, and we have to find this balance, right, to acknowledge this limitation that we are at this high, relatively general level, and somehow we have to find out, like, is that a problem for our analysis, right? Because it's not necessarily a problem, because of course each country has its specific debates about what is popular in terms of using taxes for, what is more popular, what is less popular. Of course, there are these differences, but it doesn't necessarily invalidate the basic association, right, for kind of the implications of the overall tax burden. It's more a question of composition than what you do with the taxes. It's sort of also a secondary question in a sense. But we do need to think a bit more also how it applies for the different country context. Yeah. Thanks. Yeah, Fiona, he wanted to.
I think that's everybody. I think everybody's asked their questions. So thank you very much for your presentation and for the discussion. That was great. And yeah, so the recording will be published on the YouTube channel, the INET Oxford YouTube channel and the event webpage. And then I will circulate the slides as well after this call. So thank you very much.
Perfect. I will send you the slides this afternoon. And yeah, thank you so much for organizing this, Fiona.
No worries at all.
Thank you.